Today we're going to be learning how to sculpt in Blender. We're going to be using 2.81's new tools and they improve performance overall. So first we'll do a brief overview of the key new features added in 2.81. This tutorial will be two parts broken into the basics of sculpting and then the actual character creation process of this little cat and a pumpkin. If you want to skip the basics, you can just move right on to the next video. If you're interested, the files will be available on Patreon. For now, let's get started going through the key features. So first and foremost, it's worth noticing that overall performance has just been improved. You can now have a lot more polygons on screen and it just feels a lot better to move things around. They also added this little cursor here, which as you can see rotates along the normals. This makes it easier for you to know exactly what you're grabbing, and there's also some visual information in there with the two different circles. So that inner circle represents kind of your cursor size and what you're grabbing, whereas that outer circle represents the fall off. So it'll be a gradual taper from that inside circle to the outside depending on the type of fall off you have selected. They also added new fall off presets, which can be accessed up here under fall off, and then you click this down and they have a bunch of different options to change your fall off quickly. Now, one of the coolest new tools is they added this pose tool, and what this does is it almost temporarily adds an armature to your mesh. So you don't have to have your mesh rigged when you start sculpting if you don't want to. Now, it's not going to be perfect, but it's pretty great to get you through some simple movements here. So let's see. If I want to click this ear here, I can click that, and then I can kind of move that around almost as if it had a bone on it. Now, the way this tool works is that as you drag around, it will draw this line, and that line kind of represents where the bone would be. And then if you want to change the size of that, you can just change the fall off, and you can make that bone really short so that you only affect the edge of the ear up here. Now, another cool feature they added is called the voxel remesher. Now, I've already been using this one quite a bit on my characters, and what it does is it remeshes items that have been joined together. So here we have three separate objects, and we're going to join all of these into one. Now, when we go into sculpt mode, we can sculpt all of these, but as you see, they still kind of operate individually. You can see that this is bulging out here because they are separate objects. So what we're going to do is we're going to remesh those objects. So we'll come over here to our tool panel and we'll hit remesh. Now, the option you want to pay attention to the most is this voxel size. And the smaller this number, the higher resolution this will be, but it will also take longer, especially if you're on a lower end computer. We're going to leave this as default for now. We're just going to click remesh, and now it's gone ahead and remeshed everything. So you can see here that this object separate is still kept separate over here because it's not intersecting with anything. But objects that are intersecting will then be joined together with a new mesh. This is great for combining a bunch of base primitive objects so that you can kind of get a base for your sculpts when you get moving. So you could put a few squares and triangles and circles together in the basic shape of the character you want to do, and then move on from there during sculpting. Let's move on to the basics of how to sculpt in Blender. So we're going to want to have some high resolution geometry. If you have low resolution geometry, you're not really going to have enough vertices and things to work with. So as you can see here, I've subdivided the sphere and just added more geometry so that I can actually sculpt things. Now what you want to do is you want to select your object and you'll go into sculpt mode, and immediately you'll see that we have this cursor here and we have all of our tools over here. Now there are quite a bit of tools. We're just going to cover the few that you're going to be using the most when you're sculpting. So let's go through what those different brushes are. So up here we have the draw brush, and there's a couple different variations of that with these three, but we're just going to grab the draw brush and we're going to just start drawing. And you can see here that it's drawing into our sphere. Now if we go up here to the brush settings, you can see that there's an add and a subtract. Now almost all brushes have the ability to add or subtract, meaning that they can either go in or they can come out. Now you can select up here to add or subtract, but you can also just hold control on the brush and it'll do the opposite of whatever one you have selected up here. Likewise, you can hold shift and this will take you down to the smooth brush, and you can use that to kind of smooth out everything by doing shift. We'll go through the smooth brush later and show you more settings there, but if you want to stay on one brush, you can just quickly switch back to smoothing that way. Over here in the brush settings, you can see that we have the radius and the strength. So the strength is how much it's going to affect your geometry. So if I crank that strength up, you can see that it's really pushing in there. And if I lower that strength, you can see that it's barely pushing in there. Now the radius is how big that circle is going to be. So let's crank both of those up. You can see that I'm going to just engulf the entire sphere there. So let's do something a little smaller. And you can see there that I have a pretty large radius and then I'm affecting quite a bit of the geometry. Now you can also adjust the radius and the strength with keyboard shortcuts. And you're going to want to press F and drag in and out, and that will let you adjust the radius. And then if you want to hit Shift F, that will allow you to adjust the strength. And you have that little number in there so you can see what you're landing on, and it goes from 0 to 1. I oftentimes find that I like to keep my strength not all the way on full, but not too low either. I usually keep it around just halfway, and I usually find that's kind of a good way to start sculpting. And then I adjust from there as necessary. Moving on to the other brushes, we have the inflate, and what the inflate brush does is exactly what it says. It will inflate wherever you drag with the geometry. And then of course, if you use the control, it deflates. Now below that is the blob. Now the blob's similar, except the blob will always react in a sphere. You can see very strongly how there's a sphere there. So the inflate could be that you want to make a person's nose a little bit bigger, but with the blob, you're going to just be adding these kind of blobby shapes all over your mesh. Below that, we have the crease. So if we select the crease, it's going to add a crease wherever we drag. And you can see that you kind of have to go back and forth a lot of times to get kind of some deep results, but this is great if you just want to add small details such as wrinkles, or if you want to sharpen up like a nostril of a nose or underneath an ear or something like that. Next, we have the smooth brush. Now you may be wondering why there's a dedicated brush when you have the option of just holding shift to smooth, but with this brush you get access to the radius and the strength of that right there, so that you can adjust that, because sometimes when you're holding shift it can be pretty intense on the smoothing. And I like to switch over to the smooth brush and actually just turn that smoothing way down, because I sometimes just want kind of a gentle smoothing so that I'm not destroying the details that we have. And under that, we have the flatten brush. And the flatten brush is going to flatten the surface. And what it's going to do is it's going to kind of draw a plane from whatever viewing angle you're at. It will draw a flat plane, and then it's going to flatten according to that plane. If you drag it back and forth quite a bit here, I have my strength set kind of low, you can kind of see that it's starting to flatten out that geometry. And that's really great for kind of smoothing out small little platforms, maybe if you want to add some edges to a rock or things like that. If we go down a few, we have the grab tool. Now the grab tool is great because you can just literally grab pieces of your mesh and move it around. So if you kind of don't like the way things are coming together, it's really easy just to grab large sections of your mesh and shift those around pretty easily with a natural fall off. Let's look at some of the settings we can control over here in the toolbar to our right. So over here, as we've already seen before, we have our brush settings, and I showed you how to adjust those with shortcut keys, but while you're trying to learn to memorize those, you can just adjust everything over here. Below that, we have a texture column. So if we input textures, we can select those here. So let's just create a noise texture really quick. We'll add a distorted noise there. And we'll see that that loads there. So now instead of being a smooth circle at the center, when we go to draw on here, you can see it's kind of drawing that. Now, if you wanted to do lizard skin or leather or wood or things like that, this is a really great way to kind of add that texture to your sculpting. The next section we'll look at is the fall off. So the fall off here, it controls that outer circle radius. So right now you can see that when we draw, let's go ahead and get rid of our texture. When I draw, you can see that there's just kind of this smooth natural fall off from the center out to that outer edge radius. Now let's say that we take that fall off and adjust that to a constant. That will get rid of kind of all of that fall off. You'll see that it's now a very harsh edge on the side. While doing basic sculpting, you're probably not going to adjust the fall off that much, but when you get into adding details like wrinkles and skin and things like that, you'll probably be playing with these a lot. For basics, you'll mostly be using smooth and constant. Next section we'll look at here is Dyno Typo. So Dyno Typo will add geometry rather than just mushing around the geometry you have. So if we do dyno typo, it's going to start drawing in new geometry. Now this is great when you're sculpting because you can just keep building and building and playing, and it's going to raise your geometry though, and it's not really going to be good topology. But most of the time when you're sculpting, you're not overly concerned about topology because you plan to fix that later anyways. I'm going to turn dyno typo off, go down here to the remesh. Now we showed the remesh as to how to join objects, but let's say that you just wanted to take your low res object and just add a bunch of geometry. If you didn't want to use dyno typo, you can also just remesh with this, and it just gives you kind of a remesh of everything you have there, and you can get kicking and moving there. And it's not perfect, but a lot of times the remesh topology starts off pretty well. So you can even kind of smooth around and try remeshing at the end, but you'll most likely lose some detail. So it's usually something you want to do when you're starting. The last thing we'll look at in here is the symmetry option. And you'll want to pay attention to these mirror ones here. And that just allows you to mirror it across whatever axis you have selected, so that if I draw a bunch over here, you can see that it's drawing in on the other side over there. This is great for doing things like characters and things like that, symmetrical objects, so that you can save time and not have to sculpt two sides or waste your time trying to split the geometry and add a mirror modifier. But with those tools, we know all that we need to know to get working on our little cat, so let's move on to making that.